The greatest codebreaker the United States ever produced spent 30 years on this book. He never read a word of it. A professor announced he had solved it in 1921. He turned out to be reading cracks in the ink. Computers have been thrown at it since the 1960s. They failed. In 2026, an artificial intelligence claimed it hadn't, and nobody can check. It's called the Voynich Manuscript, and here is the strange part. It isn't hidden. It isn't locked away. It sits at Yale, catalogued as Manuscript 408. Every page photographed and online, free, right now. You could open it in another tab while you watch this. You can see the handwriting. Neat, confident, fast. The hand of someone who is not inventing as they go. You can see the plants. None of them are real. You can see the diagrams of stars and the women in green pools connected by pipes that go nowhere. And beside every one of them, small, careful labels in an alphabet that appears in no other document on Earth. And nobody alive can tell you what a single one of them says. 600 years. Every code-breaking institution that matters. All of them beaten by a book that somebody, once, sat down and wrote by hand. This is not a story about a code. It's a story about what happens to very intelligent people when they meet a surface that gives nothing back. Start with what is not in dispute. On this case, that list is shorter than you would like. In 2009, researchers at the University of Arizona radiocarbon dated 4 samples cut from the vellum. The calf skin was made between 1404 and 1438. That is the hardest fact in this story. Not a Victorian forgery, not an Enlightenment hoax, not a modern fake. Somebody prepared this skin in the first half of the 15th century. And the ink sits in the surface of that skin the way ink does when it goes on, while the page is still new. There is no sign it was added later. The book runs to roughly 240 pages. Some are missing, the numbering skips, and it skips in a way that says pages were lost, not that they were never there. Several fold out into sheets far larger than the binding. One opens into 6 panels. It is a codex, made in gatherings, sewn, an object built to be used, not admired. And it is small, smaller than most people picture. It fits in 2 hands. The contents divide into sections, and scholars name them by what they appear to show. A herbal section, page after page of plants. An astronomical section, circular diagrams, stars, zodiac figures. A balneological section, the strangest to modern eyes. Small naked women standing in green pools, joined by tubes and channels. A pharmaceutical section, jars, roots, fragments. And a final section with no pictures at all. Just dense, continuous text, short paragraphs, each one marked with a star. Put it all together, and you are looking at something instantly recognizable. A 15th century reference book, a physician's compendium, a book of remedies, the kind of thing a working man of learning would own and use and wear out. Except for the plants. None of them are real. Not one of the plants in the herbal section has ever been matched, with confidence, to a species that grows anywhere on this planet. Roots that belong to one plant carry the leaves of another. Some have flowers that no botanist can place. In 1944, a researcher argued that one of them was a sunflower, which would have been extraordinary, because sunflowers are American, and that would date the book after Columbus. Nobody has been able to sustain the identification since. So the illustrator was drawing from imagination, or from a tradition we have lost, or from plants described to him rather than seen. Pick one. Nobody has been able to. Then the writing itself. It has a name now. Voynich. Somewhere between 20 and 25 distinct characters, written left to right, in a smooth, fast, practiced hand. There are no corrections. Sit with that for a moment. Across 240 pages, almost nothing is crossed out. Whoever wrote this was not working something out on the page. They were transcribing, copying something they already had, or writing a system they already knew cold. And the text behaves like language. The words are not random. Some appear constantly, some rarely, in the lopsided distribution that real languages produce. And gibberish usually does not. Word lengths cluster. Certain characters appear only at the beginnings of words, others only at the ends, others only at the beginnings of lines. But it also behaves like nothing on earth. The words repeat far more than any European language allows. The same word, 3 times in a row, which almost never happens in natural speech. And the text carries strangely little information per character. By the measurable standards of linguistics, it is both too structured to be nonsense and too repetitive to be a language anyone spoke. Try to hold both of those in your head at once. You can't. Nobody can. That contradiction is the whole case, and everything that follows is somebody trying to live inside it. The first somebodies were the owners, because if you cannot read a book, the next best thing is to find out where it has been. The Voynich Manuscript has a paper trail. It is just full of holes. The story usually begins with an emperor, Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, a man who collected the strange the way other monarchs collected land. Astronomers, alchemists, automata, a court at Prague that drew in every clever and half-mad practitioner in Europe. The story says Rudolph bought this book for 600 gold ducats, an enormous sum, believing it was the work of Roger Bacon. Here is the part that usually gets left out. There is no record of that purchase. Not in the imperial accounts, not in the archives, nowhere. The story of Rudolph and the 600 ducats comes from a letter written decades later by a man repeating what he had been told by someone else, who was, by then, dead. It is hearsay about a receipt nobody has ever seen. Remember that. This film is going to come back to it. On this case, almost everything is 1 degree removed from a document. What we do have is a name on the first page. Under ultraviolet light, a signature emerges on folio 1. Jacobus Horchitsky de Tepanek, an apothecary, ennobled by Rudolph, keeper of the imperial gardens. Somebody tried to erase that signature. It is still there. So by the early 1600s, this book is in Prague, in the hands of a man who worked with plants and medicines, which, given the contents, is the least surprising thing in the entire chain. After Horchitsky, it passes to an alchemist named Georg Beresch, and here the story turns almost painful to read. Beresch had the book for years. He could not read it. He decided it must be Egyptian, and he knew exactly who to write to. Athanasius Kircher was the most famous scholar in Europe, a Jesuit polymath who had, he believed, deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs. He was wrong about that. Spectacularly, completely wrong. His readings were fantasy, but nobody knew it yet. If you had an unreadable manuscript in the 17th century, Kircher was the man you wrote to. Barish sent him copied pages, twice. Kircher, as far as anyone can tell, never solved it and never really engaged. When Barish died, the book went to his friend Johannes Marcus Marci, rector of the University of Prague. And in 1666, Marci sent the manuscript itself to Kircher with a letter. That letter is the single most important document in the case, and it is still tucked inside the manuscript today. It is where the Rudolph story comes from. It is where the Roger Bacon attribution comes from. And Marci is careful. Read it closely and you can see him being careful. He says he is passing on what he was told. He asks Kircher to tell him if he ever reads it. Kircher never answered the question. The book went into the Jesuit collection and vanished from history for roughly 250 years. In 1912, a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich bought a crate of manuscripts from a Jesuit college outside Rome, an institution quietly selling off its library. Among them, a small, unreadable codex with a letter inside it. He spent the rest of his life trying to get it read. He circulated photostats to scholars across 2 continents. He never succeeded. Neither did his wife, the novelist Ethel Voynich. Neither did his assistant, Anne Nill. Between them, the 2 women kept the book and the search alive for another 3 decades after his death. In 1969, it was given to Yale, where it has been ever since, catalogued as Beinecke Manuscript 408. 5.5 centuries, a dozen owners. Not one of them could read it, and every single one of them was certain somebody else could. In 1921, a man finally stood up and said he had. The first man to announce a solution was not a crank. That matters, and it will keep mattering. William Romaine Newbold was a professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, a respected scholar of ancient and medieval thought, a man with a serious reputation and nothing obvious to gain. In 1921, he stood in front of the American Philosophical Society and announced that he had broken the Voynich Manuscript. His answer was spectacular. The book, he said, was the work of Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar who had written about lenses and optics centuries early. And Bacon, according to Newbold, had hidden inside it evidence that he possessed a microscope, a telescope, that he had seen living cells, that he had seen the spiral arms of a galaxy. The mechanism was the audacious part. The visible Voynichese, Newbold said, was decoration. The real text was hidden inside the pen strokes, microscopic shorthand, thousands of tiny marks too small to see with the naked eye, which he read under magnification, and then unscrambled through several further layers of anagram. It was a sensation. It made the front pages. Bacon became overnight a man centuries ahead of his time, and the proof was a book nobody else could read. For most of a decade, this was simply what the Voynich Manuscript was. Newbold died in 1926. He believed it to the end. 5 years later, in 1931, a philologist named John Manley published the examination that ended it. Manley was a Chaucer scholar who had spent the war in American military intelligence. He knew what a real cipher looked like. The microscopic letters were not letters. They were cracks. 600-year-old ink, dried onto animal skin, shrinks and fractures as it ages, and under high magnification, It breaks into a fine web of hairline splits. Newbold had spent years reading the craquelure. Every stroke gave him marks, because every aged stroke has marks. And because his method allowed anagramming, any set of marks could be rearranged until it produced Latin. There was one more problem, and it is almost unkind to say out loud. For Newbold's solution to be true, no two people examining the same stroke would ever have to agree. And they didn't. Nobody could reproduce his readings, not his colleagues, not his supporters, not even Newbold, twice on the same line. Understand what Newbold was not. He was not lying, and he was not a fool. He was a serious scholar who worked honestly for years and produced an enormous, internally consistent, completely false result. He gave the last years of his life to this book, and the book gave him back exactly what he brought to it. He built a machine for finding meaning, pointed it at a surface that had none, and the machine did what machines do. Hold on to Newbold. It will happen again, 104 years later, to something that isn't a person. If Newbold is the cautionary tale, the next men are the control group. William Friedman is, by a wide margin, the most important cryptologist the United States has ever produced. He coined the word cryptanalysis. His team broke Purple, the Japanese diplomatic cipher, before Pearl Harbor. The National Security Agency grew out of the organization he built. If there was a man on Earth equipped to break a cipher by force of intellect and method, it was this one. And in 1944, in the middle of the largest code-breaking effort in history, he started a club. The first Voynich Manuscript study group met after hours at Arlington Hall, the Army's code-breaking headquarters. These were people breaking enemy traffic all day. In the evenings, for recreation, they attacked a 15th century book. They transcribed it by hand onto punch cards. They got nowhere. In 1962, Friedman assembled a second group, and this time he brought the machine. The text was run through the era's computing power, frequency counts, pattern analysis, every statistical tool the discipline had. They got nowhere. He was not alone in failing. Brigadier John Tiltman, one of Britain's finest, a man who broke codes for 4 decades and did it, famously, largely in his head, took the manuscript up as well. He worked on it for years. In 1967, he delivered a paper on it, and the paper is essentially a catalog of everything the text is not. Not a simple substitution, not a straightforward code, not any system he recognized, and he recognized nearly all of them. Friedman worked on this book, on and off, for the better part of 30 years. And what he concluded in the end was not a solution. It was an admission. Here is how sure he was. In 1959, he published that conclusion as an anagram, a scrambled line, buried in a footnote of a paper about Chaucer. That was the standard way a scholar of his era staked a claim to a finding without publishing it outright. Think about what that means. He had spent 30 years on a text he could not read. He left his own verdict as one. The envelope was opened after he died. Inside was the sentence, "The Voynich Manuscript was an early attempt to construct an artificial language, not a code hiding a message, a made-up language, built, not encrypted." The greatest codebreaker the United States ever produced spent 30 years on this book, and his final answer was, "There may be nothing here to decode." That is not weakness. Friedman knew precisely how good he was, and he knew that being good is exactly what makes you dangerous in front of a surface like this one. Newbold gave a lecture. Friedman wrote an anagram, sealed it, and let the evidence outlive him. And then, in 1976, one of his own found the thing that has shaped every serious argument since. Prescott Currier was a Navy cryptologist who had worked at the NSA. Going through the manuscript statistically, he noticed something that nobody had properly separated before. The handwriting is not all the same. There are at least 2 distinct hands in this book, and that was the smaller half of it. The text changes too. Currier showed that the pages divide into 2 statistically different systems. Different character frequencies, different word patterns, different behavior. He called them language A and language B, not 2 topics, 2 systems following different internal rules inside one book. Hold on to that. In a few minutes it becomes the most important fact in the whole argument, because there is an explanation we have been circling for half an hour now, and it is time to say it out loud. Maybe it says nothing. Maybe it never did. That idea deserves its best possible version, not a dismissal. It is old. Friedman's own colleagues raised it, and his artificial language conclusion is a cousin of it. But it got its sharpest form in 2004, when Gordon Rugg, a researcher at Yale University, published a paper in Cryptologia titled, "An Elegant Hoax?" Rugg's argument was not that the book is meaningless because it looks meaningless. It was better than that. The standing objection to the hoax theory had always been sophistication. Voynich is too structured, too consistent, too statistical for a medieval forger to have faked. Nobody in the 15th or 16th century, so the reasoning went, understood language well enough to manufacture something that behaves like this. So Rugg tried to manufacture it. He used a cardan grill, a piece of card with holes cut in it, a real cryptographic tool of the period, named for the Italian mathematician Girolamo Cardano. Lay the card over a table of syllables, and whichever syllables show through the holes become your word. Slide the card. Next word. Change the table, and you change the statistical flavor of the output. And it works. Rugg produced text with qualitative and statistical properties resembling Voynich's. The word structure, the repetition, the lopsided distributions, using nothing but a table, a card, and patience. He suggested a forger working after 1550, and pointed in particular at Edward Kelly, an alchemist at Rudolph's court with a documented history of persuading powerful men of impossible things. It is the most uncomfortable theory in the case, because it explains, at a stroke, the 2 things nothing else explains at once. Why the text looks like language, and why 6 centuries of the finest cryptanalysts alive have got precisely nowhere. And there are 2 hard problems with it. The first is the calfskin. The vellum dates to between 1404 and 1438. Rugg's forger works after 1550, more than a century later. That is not fatal. Blank medieval vellum was valuable, and it did get reused. But a forger would need to acquire 240 pages of matching, century-old, blank skin. A strange and expensive thing to arrange. The second problem is Currier's, and it is sharper. A hoax has to be faked by somebody. Currier showed there are at least 2 hands, and 2 statistically distinct systems in this book. So the forger is not one man with a card and a table. He is at least 2 people, independently generating consistent output in 2 different systems, over 240 pages, without ever slipping. and without ever getting bored. Currier said it himself. The more than one hand and the more than one language are much harder to explain if this is a hoax. So the honest position on the hoax theory is not that it has been ruled out. It is that it is a serious, tested, mechanically demonstrated possibility that still has to explain 2 scribes, 2 systems, and 130 years of missing time. Nobody has done that, which leaves it exactly where everything else in this case sits. Not proven, not dead. And then the computers arrived, really arrived, and the case entered the age it is still in. The manuscript did not get easier. The tools got louder. By the 1990s, the whole text was digitized, and anybody with a computer could attack it. Thousands did. Amateur solutions arrive constantly, a steady decades-long stream, each one confident, each one unreproducible. The pattern Newbold set did not die. It industrialized. In 2013, 2 physicists published a serious statistical study showing that the words carrying information in the manuscript cluster the way meaningful words cluster in real texts, rather than scattering the way filler does. It is not a decipherment. It is a nudge toward something is encoded here and away from. This is noise. It did not settle the question either. On this case, nothing does. Then came 2019, and the case everyone remembers. A researcher at the University of Bristol named Gerard Cheshire published a paper in the journal Romance Studies. His argument? Voynich is not a code at all. It is a lost language, proto-Romance, a spoken Mediterranean vernacular that was never formally written down, recorded here in an improvised alphabet. It was peer-reviewed. It was published in a real journal. The university put out a press release calling it a breakthrough, and the world's media ran it. Then people tried to use it. Applying Cheshire's letter substitutions to the actual pages did not produce proto-Romance. It produced strings that had to be forced into meaning. The same word rendered several different ways. The readings depending on what the reader already expected to find. Linguists said so, publicly and quickly. The University of Bristol withdrew its own press release, saying concerns had been raised about the validity of the research. Look carefully at what did and did not happen there. Peer review passed it. A specialist journal accepted it, and a university amplified it. And it still fell, immediately, on the only test that has ever mattered on this case. Somebody else picking it up and trying to get the same answer. One gate is not enough. It never was. November 2025. A very different kind of paper appeared in Cryptologia. Michael Greshko did not try to read the manuscript. He asked a smaller, much better question. Could a person in the 15th century, using only the tools of the 15th century, have produced text that behaves like this? He built a cipher to find out, and named it the Naibi cipher, after a medieval card game. It is hand executable. A scribe with a table and a set of rules could run it at writing speed. And the output matches, not the meaning, the fingerprint, the symbol frequencies, the peculiar word structure, the repetition, the things that have made this text so strange for 600 years. Greshko is explicit that this is not a decipherment. It does not tell you what the book says. It demonstrates that a mechanism existed, in period, that could produce a text with these properties. And he did one more thing, which is the reason he is in this film. He published the code. The whole implementation, openly, for anyone to run, break, or disprove. Keep that gesture in mind. You are about to see its opposite. 2026. A private AI research institute announced it had decoded significant portions of the Voynich Manuscript using a custom-trained model. They have declined to be named, pending peer review. The methodology has not been released. The model has not been released. The outputs have not been released in a form anyone can test, so there is nothing to check. Not a refutation, an absence. It may be right. Nobody outside that building can say, and the people inside it are asking to be believed on the strength of a claim. Meanwhile, the internet filled up with pages announcing that AI had cracked the Voynich Manuscript. Written by nobody, citing nobody. Illustrated with pictures of the manuscript and confident summary paragraphs of a result that has never been shown to anyone. Confident, detailed, unanswerable. We have seen that combination before. In 1921, it wore a professor's suit. 105 years, and the pattern never changed. Newbold, in 1921, ran the finest pattern recognition instrument then available. A trained human mind had a magnifying glass, for years, across a surface with no signal. It came back with something detailed, confident, and false. Not because he was stupid, because he was capable, and because the instrument does not have an output that means there was nothing here. A large language model is the same class of instrument, several orders of magnitude larger. Train one to find structure, and it will find structure. In a cipher, in cracked ink, in elaborate nonsense, with the same fluency either way, and with no way to say, I found nothing because nothing was there. A 1921 professor and a 2025 language model can fail in exactly the same way. The failure is not in the instrument. It is in what we do with a confident answer. And notice the clock. Newbold's answer stood for a decade before Manley took it apart. Cheshire's stood for days. The 2026 result cannot be checked at all. So in one sense, it will stand forever, which is not the same thing as being right. What separated the ones who were right from the ones who were wrong was never intelligence. Every person in this story was clever. It was never credentials either. Newbold had them. Cheshire had them. Cheshire had peer review. It was only ever one thing: whether anybody else could check. Manley could check Newbold because Newbold showed his strokes. The linguists could check Cheshire because Cheshire published his substitutions. Anyone can check Greshko because Greshko published his code. Courier could be checked, and was, and his two languages have held for 50 years. And the 2026 result cannot be checked at all. That is the whole of it. Not smarter or dumber. Showed the work, or didn't. So the honest status of the Voynich Manuscript in 2026 is the same as it was in 1912. Undeciphered. Not proven meaningless. Not proven meaningful. A 15th century object that behaves like language and yields nothing. Sitting in a library in Connecticut, photographed to the last fiber, free for anyone on Earth to look at. And there is one more thing. The thing that will not leave you alone. Somebody knew what it said. This book was not made to be mysterious. It was made to be read by someone, once. Somebody ruled those lines. Somebody mixed that ink. Somebody drew the impossible plants and wrote 240 pages in a fast, confident hand without correcting themselves. And they were not performing for us. They were writing for a reader. There was a first one, maybe only one. That reader is the only person who could ever have checked any of this. Newbold's answer, Cheshire's answer, the machine's answer. One glance from them, one, and we would know. Whatever they knew, we don't. And there is nobody left to ask. The file stays open. The manuscript is public. Every page of Beinecke Manuscript 408 is digitized and free. You can look at it tonight, in bed, on your phone. Go and look at the plants that don't exist, and if you think you can read it, you would not be the first. If you want more cases like this one, subscribe. The Static Files, real cases, no endings.